I mean, I sometimes think that, the time has come, for renewed, sustained inquiry into what we mean, by evil. Lesser evil arguments are increasingly popular, in the ethics of war, but I don't think we have a good grip, of what it is that we mean.
Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. My guest today is Cecile Fabre. Professor Fabre is a moral and political philosopher working at Oxford University, and as you probably will be aware, she was actually the guest of our first ever episode. You'll notice one difference with this episode is we don't begin by introducing the guest and asking them to say what they do. The reason for that is we actually recorded 2 episodes back to back. Professor Fabre was very generous with her time. We actually talked for over 2 hours. And the result was 2 episodes, one on sex work, organ sales and intuition, and today's episode, which you're about to hear, which covers the ethics, and indeed the meta-ethics in some cases, of the death penalty, of torture, and of conduct during war. One thing that occurred to me in listening to this audio again is if you take some of what we're saying out of context, it might sound like we're arguing for the death penalty, or that we're arguing for torture. We're not. Both Professor Fabre and I are against the death penalty and think torture should be illegal in all cases. That's what we mean when we say the legal is easier than the moral. What we do, though, is we take those convictions and really push them down a flight of stairs and come up with the strongest arguments from the other side and really play with our moral intuitions here. As a final note, we talk at the end about conscription. Again, I don't want to speak for Professor Fabre here, but what I was saying when I said I'm unsure about conscription is I am not in any way in favour of conscription in today's America. I'm more asking, are there ever circumstances where it could be justified? If, for instance, the only way that Britain could have defeated Germany in the Second World War was by using conscription. That may or may not be the case historically, but just say it is. Would then conscription be justified? And my answer is sort of I don't know, and it would depend on the circumstances, and it's messy and complicated. And I think that should do as an introduction. If you are liking the show, please follow us on Facebook or Twitter. You can find the links to all of that on our website, politicalphilosophypodcast.com, politicalphilosophypodcast.com, all one word. And really the best way to support the show, which is still a fairly new project, is to share it on your own social media. If there's an episode you particularly like, please help us out by growing our audience and share that on Facebook, Twitter, whatever it is you use. So, without further preamble, it is my pleasure to bring you, for the second time, Professor Cecile Fabre. So we've gone round the block on intuitions. It feels like we're on a similar page with maybe me being a little bit more epistemically confident than you.
Yes,
Is that a fair prelude?
Yeah.
So one thing, because I know you've written a lot on state control over bodies and on war, is I feel like our intuitions on when the state can use violence, and specifically when it can take life, are all over the map. They're both all over the map in that different ideological traditions have very different answers, but they're also all over the map in terms of, even within an ideological tradition, they seem to me incongruous. So, like most leftists, I sort of have the intuition that capital punishment, it's not just that it's ineffective or badly applied, there's something really off. And when you talk about capital punishment, liberals will say the state absolutely should not be able to take the life of its citizens. But then if you go to, say, police action, if you have a sniper on the roof, even liberals who are very cautious of the use of police violence will say, okay, no, you've got to take that guy out. And then when it comes to war, all bets are off. Even liberals will be like, well, you know, if your country gets invaded, then suddenly just everything gets put on the table. And that seems, so like even within one tradition, there's no congruence at all as far as I can see. We're not going to be able to map out like a full theory of this, but how would you begin to start thinking about that?
Yeah, so that's a huge question. So the liberals, you are, describing, of, whom I am, might want to think about or start drawing distinctions, between, taking a life as a way to eliminate, an ongoing threat, onto another life. So that's what's happening with the sniper, case, or, with a police chase case, or indeed even with a war case. So, draw a distinction between those, cases. So when, the taking of a life is eliminative, as it were, from cases where, the taking of a life is punitive. So, ex post, we kill blogs, by electrocution, as punishment, for the murder, which he committed. So that's the first thing that I would enjoy, those liberals to do, to try and sort out whether, one rationale, for the different intuitions that they have might have to do with that deeper, distinction, between eliminating on the one hand and punishing, on the other hand. It's not that clear-cut because, of course, if you believe in deterrence arguments,
I was just going to say, yes.
And of course, by killing, by executing the criminal, you are in effect seeking to eliminate or to block, the commission of further murders, down the line by deterring, putative.
Could we just dig in there for a minute? Because even before we get to war, it seems like our moral intuitions on the case of, like, capital punishment is almost like a uniquely confused debate, I think. So let's just take off the punitive stuff, because I think that actually is a prime example of what I'm talking about when we talk about moral illusions, right? In that I've just said on the positive side, we reward people for doing good things, actually doesn't make a lot of sense because we didn't choose most of what we call good things. But that goes for the negative as well, right? So punishment is a very strong intuition, but I think doesn't cash out. I think can be overridden by more fundamental intuitions. So let's take all of that off the table. Let's also take efficacy off the table. So people will say, oh, but the capital punishment actually costs more than just locking someone up for life. I feel like no one's actually convinced by that argument. If it turned out it was cheaper, would you change your mind? I don't think they would.
So I think it's a very good question as to whether or not it's even the right kind of argument, to put forward, against capital punishment. And it goes back to money, actually. I think that's a very good. I mean, it's a good example of that more general view that there are areas where arguments about money or considerations of money should not come into play. And so some people take the view, and I'm sympathetic, that we can't. It's problematic to argue against capital punishment, on grounds of money. That shouldn't come into it.
I also just feel like it's an additional thing. No one's actually convinced by it, right? And if the data was the other way round, people wouldn't change their minds. There's also, let's just take off the table the question of getting the wrong outcome, because I think it's terrifying, the idea of executing an innocent person, but the idea of imprisoning an innocent person for life is, I'm not sure, less terrifying.
Well, I agree. I agree with you. Yeah.
At the heart of it, I think there's the idea that the state should not be killing its own citizens. But then the idea of deterrence really plays amok with that. Now, the empirical evidence, as I'm aware of it, I'm not an expert, is that it's really mixed. You can find people who say there is a deterrence effect to capital punishment. You can find people who say there isn't. The data's very messy. There's only a few advanced countries that still do it. Yeah. But let's just say the sniper on the roof, if you kill him, you have a reasonable expectation of saving 3 more lives. In that case, it becomes not only ethically permissible, but I would argue ethically necessary to kill the sniper. If, and I don't think this is true, but let's just say that it were, by executing someone, there is such a strong deterrence effect that you save 3 more murders. In that counterfactual, would it then become ethically necessary to execute people?
Yeah, well, so that's interesting. So we need, in the deterrence, case, we need to distinguish 2 variants. The first variance is special, deterrence. So is it the case that the only way to prevent him, he has killed once already, let's say, is it the case that the only way to prevent him from killing 3 more people is to kill him? That's special deterrence. So we punish the wrongdoer as a means to deter him, or to preventing him from committing further, wrongdoing. So in this particular case, it seems to me that if you are committed to the permissibility of defensive killing in the sniper case, you have to commit yourself to the permissibility of capital punishment in the special, deterrence, case. The second deterrence variant is general deterrence. So here the thought is not that by killing him, by electrocuting him, we will prevent him or deter him from killing 3 people. We will deter other putative wrongdoers, from committing, murder. And I think it's much harder to justify, capital punishment in the latter, general deterrence case, because in the general deterrence case, he whom we are about to execute is not going to pose the threat that we are trying to eliminate in the future. It's other people, putative murderers, whom we are trying to deter by showing to them that we mean business, that if they kill, we are going to kill them.
But where's the ethical traction of that distinction? I mean, I see the distinction, but if we're just...
So the ethical... So one argument which has been put forward to show that there is something deeply problematic about the deterrence, argument in the second case is that by killing, the murderer as a means to deter other, murderers, we would be using him as a means and as a means only, to the end of, preventing, those future murders. And for people who are sympathetic to the Kantian prohibition on using people as means only, then, general deterrence so construed is really, really problematic. Now, in the end, you're going to have to come up with that rock bottom intuition that, there is something wrong, to using people as a means only to the furtherance of a particular end, even, people who have committed a crime, as significant, as murder. Not everyone takes that view. So my friend and colleague Victor Tadros, whom you should try to interview if you haven't planned to do that already,
recommendation
has
noted,
sophisticated arguments in favor of deterrence, where he tries to show that even general deterrence does not violate, the Kantian prohibition. I don't think he succeeds. So that, that's where my reservation is. I mean, that murderer might say, well, look, I'm not, we agree, ex hypothesize that I'm not going to murder again. On what grounds can you kill me as a means to prevent those 3 putative murderers?
The only tool you can get into that particular crack is a deontological principle of means and ends. If you're trying to just map up from a morally consequentialist suffering matters,
then that's different. So you're right, that consequentialists, won't have the problem, that I'm describing. What I find interesting to this particular way of, thinking about general deterrence, where we incorporate the Kantian prohibition, is that some people are pure consequentialists. They don't worry at all, about the way in which, certain results, are brought about. But a lot of people are not extreme consequentialists, of that kind. And I think to those people who believe that there is a role, for deontic constraints, in morality, that is what's going to be problematic, about capital punishment in a general, deterrence, case. They will say, well, look, it's one thing to kill someone as a means to prevent him from killing another person, be it the sniper or the murderer who will reoffend if we don't kill him. It's another to kill someone who ex hypothesi is no longer and will no longer ever be a threat.
So I'm going to make a move. Like, my intuition is against the death penalty. I don't really know why I'm digging in here. But I'm increasingly unconvinced that I can actually cash that intuition out. So let me make a move that consequentialists tend, or those of us who are sort of inclined to this way of thinking, tend to make in these situations, is to just scale up the consequences. Let's say the deterrence effect isn't 3, it's 30. Let's say it's 300. Let's say we could halve the national murder rate just by killing this one guy. At what point does that principle start to break down?
So, I think it's a very, very powerful challenge. So it's a very powerful challenge to Kantians like me, who are not absolutist Kantians, who think that there is, a place. Of course, there has to be a place for consequences. And the move that we, tend to make is very feeble, at this point, unfortunately, is to say, well, there are cases where, you might be justified in deliberately harming, even severely harming another person as a means, to bring about some good. And these are lesser evil, arguments. But note, the use of the word evil. So, in order, to justify, committing the evil of deliberately killing someone who is no longer a threat, as a means to bring about the good, then you have to be able to show that what you are preventing is A, an evil, B, a greater evil. So not just any good, will do.
You could map this on, because I think that the example I just gave is a pure hypothetical. It is obviously, it's hard to imagine how a deterrence effect that strong would even operate, right? If it does, it's operating at the margins. It's not like you'd save hundreds of lives. But if you take the case of torture, you can quite easily imagine a real-world scenario in which... So this is where I think consequentialism can kind of earn its stripes, is I think you can have a general prohibition against torture, which is that even if there are local instances where it would maximise well-being, overall societies that torture people are worse places to live. It's a bit like, would you hang an innocent man to prevent a riot that kills 10 people?
Sure.
It maximises it in the local instance, but in the general you want a functioning justice system. But what's open to a consequentialist is if you say, okay, would you torture someone to save a life? No, because of the general argument. 2 lives? No. To stop a nuclear bomb going off over Manhattan? There's a scenario that could occur in. And then the consequentialist can just say, well, sure, this is a scenario that's outside of the general logic of that rule that I was putting forward. It seems to me the deontologist gets a bit stuck there.
Well, yes, she does. I think so. So there are several, things going on. The first point to make is that we need. It seems to me, and again now in a nice circle, we go back to the very first theme of our discussion, that we need to distinguish. It seems to me the question of whether a particular course of action is morally right, from the question of whether that course of action ought to be legally, authorized or legally disallowed or criminalized. So, someone might say, well, yes, I can accept that in the ticking bomb scenario, torture is morally permissible, but we don't live in a ticking bomb scenario. And, those hard cases, the argument will continue to make bad laws. So that's the first, point to make. We need to distinguish, those two kinds of inquiry. Now, that doesn't leave the deontologist off the hook when it comes to the moral, inquiry, precisely.
Right. The legal's easier than the moral.
The legal is much easier than the moral, absolutely. And, as a moral and political philosopher of a fairly strong, Kantian bent, it would be dishonest of me, to say that even, in the case where we would save 2 million lives, by torturing an innocent person, we ought not to torture. I think that may well be a case where we may, torture. Now, there are, further things to, think about as to whether or not we commit a wrongdoing, by torturing, such as there is a moral remainder that we owe, something, very important to that person, that innocent person, whom we are torturing. There are other questions to do with, well, who is going to do it? Can we deploy a conscientious objection, to doing that if we are the person called upon, to torture, to fight, to kill, and so on and so forth. But I would have to say that, the forestalling of evil may sometimes require, the imposition of, those profoundly, grievous, grievous harms. I sometimes think that, the time has come, for renewed, sustained inquiry into what we mean, by evil. Lesser evil arguments are increasingly popular, in the ethics of war, but I don't think we have a good grip, of what it is that we mean, by that.
I think this is one of these things where it's not even the concept; it's literally the sound of the word. Like people are uncomfortable with evil,
No, I agree. And so I think that when I listen to to myself or to my colleagues in that world, say, well, that's okay. We have the lesser evil, argument. I often think, well. Right, but that's you just made a rhetorical point, but what do you mean, by evil? At which point, can we say, well, no, what we would be, preventing, A, is evil, 2, is a much greater evil than the harm that we would be doing.
So let's summarize. We did get some moral traction between, say, execution or torture on the one hand, and taking down police action on the other, although that traction only works to the extent that you buy deontological principles.
Yeah, yes.
I think that's an interesting conclusion in and of itself.
Yeah, good. Yeah.
So let's wrap it up. Are there any wedges we could draw between police action and war? Because I think people feel very intuitively differently about these.
Yeah.
So what, in war, you would kill an enemy soldier who was not, per se, an immediate threat to you. You would take life in ways that fall outside of the justification you gave for killing the sniper. So what point do we map up?
So that's one important difference, between it's one important difference that people have identified, between the use of force in police cases on the one hand and the use of force in war cases on the other hand. And, one way in which, they draw the distinction is that in war, because of the nature of warfare, you have to accept that in order to protect yourself, your fellow citizens, your fellow soldiers, you have to commit many more preventive killings, than would be the case in domestic settings. If you don't have an overall overarching neutral enforcer of norms, internationally, such as the police, well then, soldiers' units are left, to fend for themselves to a much greater degree. There are fewer opportunities to escape, for example, than there are, in domestic settings. So let me give you an example. The case of the naked soldier comes back all the time. So you're on patrol at war, and you come across a naked enemy soldier. He's taking a bath, or he's asleep, and so you have to decide whether to kill that soldier or not. If you don't, because we are at war, then it's very likely that soldier will either kill you, the next morning, or kill one of your fellow, soldiers a week from thence, and so on. But if I encounter, someone in, a domestic setting, if I encounter someone who is asleep and of whom I know that he might pose a threat to me, I'm much more likely, to be able to find refuge, somewhere else, so to be able to call the police, than I would be, in the context of war. So that's one. I mean, I think there are serious problems, with that disanalogy, between the two cases. But that is one of the disanalogies that people, have identified.
So that almost brings us back to, I might be slightly misunderstanding this, but that almost brings us back to like the capital punishment case, in that in war we're looking at it from a much more broadly. In the police case, it's only specifically, is that.
In this case, we have an immediate threat, here and now, and we tend to think in the police case that we should kill only when we are faced with an imminent or ongoing threat. Now, we also tend to think along those lines in the war case, except that in the war case, it seems to me that a lot of people would have a more generous, if you will, or more elastic, conception of what constitutes an ongoing threat. I mean, in the war case, the soldier who is asleep, insofar as he participates, in a war, poses an ongoing threat, even though he himself, is not yielding the gun, he's asleep. Whereas, in the domestic police case, if we chance upon a serial killer who is asleep, we want to say to the police, well, you don't kill him, you try to capture him. That's what you have to do.
Right. So a thought occurs, which is, so would you, by that logic, follow Thomas Hobbes down the line of saying your argument assumes that there is sort of a structure and a justice system and a set of norms and laws governing society, so you can, if the murderer by the side of the road is naked and unarmed, or you don't kill him because there's someone to come and lock him up. But if you're in, as some people still are today, like a non-functioning state scenario where there isn't, then do you have, as Hobbes put it, a war of all against all?
Yeah, well, so I think that's a very interesting point. So it seems to me that those philosophers of war of whom I'm not, who think that there is a clear line of demarcation, if you will, between the use of force in domestic, by which they mean police type context on the one hand, and the use of force in war type context on the other hand. Those philosophers presuppose, without making it explicit, a roughly well-functioning state, where the police will turn up, if you call 999 or 911, because you found, a sleepy, a serial, killer down the road. But in many cases, states are failing, and I think it's an important fact, to bear in mind, when we think about the norms that ought to regulate the use of force in those cases. So my view is that the norms that ought to regulate the use of force in war are coterminous, are the same, as the norms that ought to regulate the use of force in domestic settings. I don't think that war, is a special domain, which admits, of its own norms, and which are radically different or substantially different, from the norms that ought to regulate the use of force, in domestic, settings. I mean, I don't know how much time we have, but it would be remiss of me not to finish this bit of our discussion by pointing to another disanalogy. We started a moment ago by thinking, okay, so what are the differences between killing someone in the context of a police operation and killing someone in the context of war. And one important difference has to do with construals of, imminence, ongoing threats, and so on and so forth. But there's another, difference which to some people is even more, important, which is this, that in war contexts, once the war has been declared by a political body which has the authority to declare war, then the soldiers on whose behalf and at whose behest, the soldiers who are going to fight on behalf and at the behest of that authority are morally permitted, and indeed they are legally permitted, to kill enemy soldiers irrespective of the moral status of the war in which they are fighting. So on this view, once Germany has invaded Poland, in the early days of September 1939, even though, ex hypothesi, the war waged by Germany against Poland is an unjust and illegal war, the acts of killing committed by German soldiers against Polish soldiers are not wrongful. They are not regarded as acts of murders. Those soldiers have been authorized by the government, the Nazi government, to kill Polish soldiers, even though they kill these Polish soldiers in pursuit of an unjust war of aggression. And likewise, the Polish soldiers are morally entitled and legally permitted to kill the German soldiers. So you've got two groups of people, the German soldiers and the Polish soldiers, who are at liberty to kill one another, irrespective of the moral status, of the war in which they are fighting, which is an unjust war of aggression on the German side and a just war of self-defense on the Polish side. But in police-type settings, it's completely different. Suppose you have a shootout, between the police on the one hand and the mafia, on the other hand, then the relationship, the killing, relationship between individual police officers on the one hand and mafia members on the other hand is profoundly asymmetrical. We would not say of the mafiosi, well, they've been authorized by Don Corleone to go and shoot at police officers, so they are morally permitted to do that. We would say that these mafiosis are liable to a charge of murder if they kill police officers.
Go ahead.
So,
no, I have two follow-ups occur here. The first, I guess, is quite simple, but it's the authorization argument in the use of war clearly must have limits, right? In that, well, so if you say I was only following orders, that phrase is immediately evocative of Nuremberg, where the idea is that that there is a limit to what we will let people say. I was authorized by my state to do this. Now, it's incredibly difficult to enforce, and even at its best, it can look like victor's justice. But that we don't carry that all the way down the road, right?
Yeah, good. Yeah, so the people I've just described, the philosophers I've just described, and Michael Walzer is one of the best contemporary examples who draw this sharp distinction between the criminal case on the one hand and the war case on the other hand. Of course, accept that there are many cases in which you cannot just say, I was just following orders. So the challenge for those philosophers is to explain why a soldier cannot invoke Nuremberg, the Nuremberg defense, to justify his having killed innocent civilians, but can invoke, I was ordered to leave the barracks, to justify killing enemy combatants, even though his war, was unjust. So they're very complicated, sophisticated arguments to do with the fact that, for example, an ordinary rank and file soldier ought to be able, to develop the resources to resist, in order to kill innocent civilians once the war has started, but cannot be expected to reach a personal judgment, about the justice of the cause, before the war, has already, begun. But I think those arguments are very problematic. And again, it seems to me that we should treat, broadly speaking, we should treat the mafia case, in the same way, or rather we should treat the war case, in importantly similar ways as we treat the mafia, case.
So then, the next question I have is, how far of this would this sort of constitute a moral argument for the nation state, understood in a sort of Weber's sense of a monopoly on the legitimate means of violence, insofar as, I think you know where I'm going with this, but if to the extent that to which you can just call the police when you see the unarmed murderer, as opposed to having to physically take him out, that's surely a huge moral improvement, as well as just like we've been talking about consequentialism, just a brute force consequentialist improvement. I guess another way of putting it is Thomas Hobbes essentially correct here if we follow down that line?
So I have to think more about the Thomas Hobbes point. I mean, so it's one thing to say, in the end, the state has, monopoly over the use of violence. It's another to try and translate that in the international arena. I mean, we don't have a UN army.
No. I'm more just thinking on the point of view is the nation state morally justified? Because, like, when you do any sort of introduction to political philosophy course, you get this question of, like, political obligation, and people have, like, transactional accounts, and it gets really complicated really fast. But you could just sort of look at it the way we're looking at it and say, given that the norm observance is going to lead to less, the necessity of less killing, and probably the reality of less killing, there's your justification for the state.
So that's the justification for the state. It doesn't need to be, the state doesn't need to be coterminous with the nation. So I prefer talking about justifying the state, rather than, or instead of talking about justifying the nation state.
That's a good distinction. I stand corrected. Sorry, go on.
But then you get into complications because take a profoundly dictatorial regime. It's plausible on the one hand to say that living under that dictatorial regime, is better, all things considered, than living under no state, at all. You might even say that in some respects of Stalinist, Russia, and in other respects, you might also say that for, most ordinary Germans, of living under, the Nazi regime, when the alternative is absolutely no state, is the state of nature. So it's one thing to make that concessive move, but it's quite another, to say that, or to infer, from that concessive move, that we are under an obligation to obey any order as given, by this particular, institution. So, to say on the one hand that the, Soviet citizens had some reasons to obey at least some of the directives, as issued by the Stalinist regime, is compatible, it seems to me, with the view that they were not under a duty not to overthrow that regime, if they could replace it, with something, better. So that I think, is an indirect way of responding to your question about Hobbes. One of the worries about Hobbes is that it seems to be an either-or, answer to the question. It's either the state of nature or an absolutist, sovereign. Which is the Locke's, response is, well, no, it's not an either-or. They are, intermediate. State, institutional arrangements which protect us, from the worst, the state of nature, without exposing us to the worst stuff, the absolute sovereign,
which would bring us to, say, Locke, which is that you can get governmental arrangements so bad that a reversion to a state of nature can be the lesser evil.
Yes,
in that case.
That's right, in that case, yeah. I mean, it's complicated with Hobbes because, as you know, he also takes the view that you are entitled to, and you are prudentially required to give priority to your own survival, so that, if the sovereign knocks on your door, with a view to taking you away, to put you to death, even if you, have committed murder, and even if there is a sense in which the sovereign is at liberty, to execute you for that, you yourself are at liberty to resist.
Right. So the Hobbes public-private divide is not exactly a well-enmeshed protection for the individual.
No,
the state can hang you, but you can scream all the way to the gallows.
That's right. So it would be misleading, to say that the sovereign is absolute in Hobbes's account, in the sense that we are under a duty to obey whatever order it issues. I mean, that clearly is not the case, but it's absolute in that it and it alone, and preferably as a monarch, creates the laws.
So let's make this the final question. That brings you on then to the issue of conscription, right? So even Hobbes, who is sort of as authoritarian a political philosopher as you're going to get, is like, Hobbes is against conscription, right? His
Well,
view.
so it depends what you mean by against. I mean, I would have to reread. I mean, I haven't read that bit of advice in a very long time. I don't think he says that the sovereign is not morally entitled to try conscript you.
No, the sovereign can, but the reason you join a state in the first place is to protect your own life. And if the state's making, I don't want to go to war, it's dangerous, exactly. You could get killed. The whole point of being in a state is to not get killed, right?
That's right. So then you're allowed, you commit no wrong, if you flee, before the sovereign's, agents turn up, on your doorstep, to press gang you, into the army. I mean, I think conscription is difficult. Again, it's an interesting example of the ways in which the state claims to exercise an enormous amount of control, over your body. You have to move your body in the ways that are, required by the imperatives of battles, and insofar as you are a conscript, you don't have a choice. On pain of fairly severe penalty in some cases, you just have to do it. I mean, I'm torn on conscription, so. But I'm going to have to go soon, actually, I realize. But I'm sympathetic to the view, and in fact, I defend the view in the book that you mentioned earlier. I don't simply argue that under some circumstances we are morally entitled to sell, bits of our body. I also defend the view that under other circumstances we are under a moral obligation to provide, body parts, but relevantly to conscription, bodily services, for the sake of others. So if in order to survive you don't need my money, you need me to do something for you, walking to the telephone to call 999, performing CPR and so on and so forth, I am under a pro tanto duty to do it, a duty to provide that particular kind of service. And that opens the door, to an argument in favor of conscription, as a way to discharge duties of assistance, to one another.
That's a very you way of making that argument, right? Because you've just gone from something that would be profoundly morally counterintuitive to most people to something that is actually morally neutral. I think most people actually don't really know what they feel about conscription. But I mean, it certainly follows that if the state can claim, certain controls over your body to save the lives of others in terms of blood and tissues and organs and stuff like that, it certainly that there would be some door open for conscription, right? So
it opens the door. Now, duties to provide help, need to be constrained by what I and others call a no undue sacrifice proviso. So, you can argue that, whether I am under duty to do something for you, depends on, the costs, that I would incur, in doing so. And so you might then go on to say, well, the costs I would incur by donating blood or by, rescuing a child from a very shallow pond are minimal. I am definitely under a duty to incur those costs. The costs of fighting in a war, both physical, material, and moral, costs are much higher. So, any argument in favor of conscription that would appeal to duties of assistance would have to be sensitive, to those costs. So all I want to commit myself to at this point is to say, well, given some of the views I have and which I still hold, about the nature of the assistance that we might be under a duty to provide, not just money, but personal, services, then there is no reason to rule out conscription in principle, on the grounds that it consists in providing a service, the service of fighting.
We should close soon, but this might be an idea of like how weird my moral intuitions are, in that your arguments about like claiming body parts just make complete sense to me. I was like,
so what do you think about conscription then?
I don't know.
Right. Okay. So
so I view the shallow pond as essentially valid and normative, right? In the Peter Singer thing of like, if you'd ruin your $50 shoes to go in the pond to rescue a child, shouldn't you be under the same obligation to give a $50 donation to a charity?
Right.
Yeah, I think that's essentially valid. And I think the mechanism isn't that the state comes round and arrests you because, you rejected the Oxfam canvasser.
Yeah.
It's the state says, well, no, we're going to tax you and we're going to set aside a certain portion of your income for this. I can't see that we have any claim at all on our body's organs after we die. That just,
okay. So you agree with me there? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. No, I read your book and I was like, I honestly hadn't thought about it much, but I was like, yeah, after you die, No, I mean, I don't think you're not there to own your body, and I don't think your family can claim to own your body either. And if there's a life to be saved, that just overrides any other concern. Now, I think that the shallow pond doesn't scale up. So I don't mean that it's not generalizable. I mean that should you go into the shallow pond to save the child? Yes. Should you go into the burning building to save the child? Well, it would be great if you did, but I don't think anyone could hold you morally accountable for not. And so when it comes to like claiming body parts from others, I would be totally fine with some sort of modest government scheme whereby you could get a tax write-off for giving blood, or maybe even fined for not, or something like something. But I mean, the economic incentive works the same way, so it's more palatable, I think, to have a tax write-off for rather than a penalty for not. But it's morally, I think it's about the same difference. That's more just a messaging question. But I think then, should you have to give up your kidney for another person who needs it? I think that's much more akin to running into the burning building. So there's a limit, but I think I'd go with you down that road much further than most people would.
The really difficult question, it seems to me, has to do with, well, at one point, can we say that the costs are simply too high? What makes it really complicated in the case of war, in general, conscription in particular, is that now we start talking about the psychological cost of, killing, another person. So I find it really fascinating that studies about the stress levels encountered in drone pilots, so who operate thousands of miles away, from the battlefield and are not in any way in any physical danger, show that those stress levels are at least as high, if not higher, than the stress levels registered by soldiers who fight, on the ground. And that I find really, really, interesting. So we need to start in those cases before. I would be willing to say that, conscription, is also considered justified. Justified, I would want to, think harder about a whole range of costs, which are not merely, to repeat, physical or material, but moral, costs, psychological, costs, which, the agent would have to, incur. I mean, I don't have a principle that would tell us, in a somewhat mechanical way, oh yeah, that cost is too high, that cost is not too high. I think this is where you have to look at it on a case-by-case, basis, and try to scrutinize your intuitions as honestly, as possible.
I mean, that might just be the answer, though, right? Is that this is something as messy and complicated as this. There's just not a clear, bright line, and in a way, it would be weird if they were.
So I don't know whether it would be weird if there were. I mean, our moral life might be easier, if there were. But so my colleague Tony Cody, he's written quite a bit about war and other matters, calls this messy morality, and I think he's right. I mean, that's a clear, example, of messy morality. It's a mess, we just have to, do the best that we can, by using the, reflective equilibrium method or variant thereof, which we discussed earlier, as rigorously and honestly, as we can.
That seems like a good pause.
Yeah, I think it's a good way to pause, actually. Yeah.
So let's leave it there.
I've really enjoyed that. We've gone much longer than I thought, but it's been really fun.
Than I thought.
Yeah, no, it's been really. You were very good actually at leading us, through the broadly agreed, structure, of the interview. So that felt really good.
Oh, I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to the Political Philosophy Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, then please do like and subscribe. The links to all of that are on our website, politicalphilosophypodcast.com. So our schedule of which guests are going to be coming up is a little bit out of sync because I made some commitments to guests to get their episodes up early. So, for instance, I just talked with Professor Richard Winfeld, who is a philosopher running for Congress. Philosophers running for office seems to be something of a recurring theme on this show. So I made a commitment to get his episode out before his primary election, which I'm happy to do. So stay tuned to our social media for updates on who's going to be coming on the show. We do have some really cool announcements. We've got some big names in human rights and in the atheist community who are going to be coming on the show. I'll say no more than that, but there's a couple of people coming on who you'll know who they are, and that's really cool. And we've also got more really world-leading academics coming on as well, which is all really exciting. So if you want to get those updates, please do follow us on social media. Apart from that, and I don't mean to be coy about the announcements, I just want to have everything confirmed before I do announce it. Apart from that, thank you so much for listening. That we've received some really positive feedback from these conversations is fantastic. It makes me really happy, genuinely. So thank you for taking the time to listen to this. It's really appreciated. And until next time.